Now, we're studying tonight in the Gospel of Matthew, which I've called the Gospel for a Church in a Sophomore Slump. So, St. Matthew, this is one of the traditional pictures with the angel whispering in his ear, and we're looking at his gospel. Again, we don't know for sure if it's Matthew the Apostle. That's been the traditional word of it, so we're going to go for that at least for now. What we're looking at, Matthew pulls together the teachings of Jesus in 5 major blocks of sayings. And in a number of cases, these sayings also include a lot of material that is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And I think one of the wonderful ways to study the Gospels, these 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, is to try to pay attention to the ways that they are different. Not try to harmonize them into one big salad bowl or blend them into a pureed gospel of just one. Don't be alarmed about the differences. In fact, pay close attention. Lean in to when they have differences, because those are the aspects that are unique to that story and give it its richness. So a lot of these uniquenesses are found in these collected sayings in the Gospel of Matthew. We looked at the Sermon on the Mount, which was the first of those last time. Tonight we're going to look at a particular set of sayings which in the other Gospels are scattered out, if they're in there at all. Some are unique to Matthew. Others are found but scattered out in various other places. Matthew seems to have pulled them together into one place. So this is kind of like Jesus' greatest hits, instructions to disciples, and we're going to see these collected up together here. You can see some other places that we're going in these other gatherings of sayings, and in each case, all 5 of these end with kind of a phrase that says, "And when Jesus had finished saying this, then." And so that's kind of the catchphrase, the punctuation mark, if you will, that Matthew puts in to say, all right, pay attention, that's the end of that point. Now we're going on to the next one. So that's pretty clear. Matthew did this collection on purpose, and as we said last time, probably it's a whisper to Jesus being kind of like our new Moses, the same way Moses gave the Israelites 5 books of Moses in the so-called Pentateuch. So we're going to look at the ones in Matthew chapter 10, and I start out with this. Do you remember the song, "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? The Big Bad," sing it with me, "The Big Bad Wolf. Who's afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" Tra-la-la-la-la. Yeah, if you hadn't babysat in a while, you don't remember that. Anyway, who was afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? Who sang that before you just did? 3 little pigs, right? Yes, one of those grim fairy tales. The 3 little pigs, who were, by the way, completely afraid of the big bad wolf. They just sang it in the hope that they maybe could get through their fear, right? So they're scared to death because wolves love pork chops. And so they're afraid of this wolf hopping and blowing like a, number 3 hurricane outside their door, and they're, who's afraid? But wolves also, you mentioned Little Red Riding Hood, wolves also love Little Red Riding Hood. That particular fairy tale, you remember you're not supposed to talk to strangers, especially if they look like wolves in the woods, which is kind of what we announced to our children, or at least our daughters, before they went off to college. But at any rate, the story of Little Red Riding Hood, she talks to the wolf, he runs ahead to grandmother's house, and it's pretty a gruesome story. I won't upset you with that. But at any rate, the Little Red Riding Hood is also apparently part of the favorite diet of wolves. But you know what wolves love the most? You know what the favorite menu item for wolves? It's lamb chops. Wolves love mutton. It's their favorite prey. And the reason, of course, is because they're the easiest one. Almost all the other animals that the wolves love to eat have some chance of fighting back. They've got tusks or hoofs, or, they're fast or they can fly or something like that. Not lambs. Lambs have absolutely no self-defense. Think of a lamb, right? They don't have sharp teeth. They can't fly. They're not fast. Basically, when a wolf comes up to a lamb, the lamb just offers it a knife and a fork and says, "Here am I." They have no way to resist a wolf. And so for a wolf, there's not any better delicacy, not only because it tastes good, it's just really easy to catch and eat. I mean, lambs have no chance against wolves. And yet in our text tonight, these arch-enemies of each other, arch-enemy and favorite diet of each other, Jesus is going to use these images, and he's going to say, "I'm sending you, my disciples, I'm sending you out like lambs in the midst of wolves." And they'd be very familiar in first century Palestine about how much the odds are stacked against them. I don't know what you thought about the Super Bowl, or underdogs or whatever, but the lambs are definitely underdogs against the wolves. I'm sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. That's the image that I think we're to try to see in this particular passage, which is pretty tough. So there's our little lamb there on the left and our wolf on the right. Which one do you think is going to win that battle? Why would Jesus, wouldn't it be better if he just sent us out more fortified, more armored up, just to give us more of a chance against the wolves? Have you, one of the things Jesus is going to try to teach his disciples, all of us, because this is kind of an inner circle, it's kind of like a huddle, a team meeting with Jesus and his disciples. It isn't the crowds, it isn't the multitudes. Tonight's lesson in Matthew is Jesus huddling up those who are really committed to him and giving them a sense of what is their mission and what can they expect. That's basically what this is about. And he starts out with that incredible metaphor. Now, there are a couple of passages in here that are pretty striking. Actually, before I even get to that, let's look in chapter 10, verse 1. Jesus calls the 12 disciples to him. Matthew loves to call the disciples the 12. And at first in the gospel, he says the 12 disciples. By the end of the gospel, he just says the 12. And everybody knows who the 12 are. And what in the Old Testament do you think 12 disciples, the fact that there were 12, that's part of it, but what do you think 12 disciples would remind a Jewish ear person to think about? What in the Old Testament would that echo? 12 tribes of Israel, that's exactly right. So it's kind of, the disciples represent this new people of God, this new Israel, these disciples that he's pulled together. But interestingly enough, unlike Mark, in the Gospel of Matthew, we've had earlier the story of the calling of Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, James and his brother John, the 4 fishermen. And then we also have in the Gospel of Matthew, prior to this, the story of the calling of Matthew, the tax collector. When the Gospel of Mark tells that story, he names him Levi. But anyway, this is apparently the same story. Now he's called Matthew, a tax collector. And that's really the only 5 we've heard about if you're just reading the Gospel of Matthew. Then all of a sudden, he's calling the 12. So clearly there were 7 others who came up along the way. And he lists them all. And like all the list of the apostles, it always starts with Peter, probably because he was the first one called. I don't know if that's setting him up as the first pope necessarily, but he certainly was the leader of the apostles in that sense. Simon, also called Peter, Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, his brother John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew, the tax collector. This, by the way, is the only one of the 12 whose occupation is mentioned. Some of them mentioned whose son or brother or whatever they were, but this is the only one that says, and so it makes you wonder, if Matthew was actually the writer of this gospel, he's not letting you forget that Matthew was a tax collector. That, by the way, is no small thing, because when you get a little bit further in that list, there's also James, the son of Alphaeus, separating from James, son of Zebedee, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot. Do you have a Bible that says Simon the Canaanite? Is that what you have, some of you? So Simon, it could have been, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to call him from Canaan, because actually they're all from Canaan. That's the old description of Palestine. Most likely it's saying, it's a phrase that's used for people who were zealots. And zealots were actually somewhat of a pretty radical political party, you might say. They were the people who were most likely to turn to violence to oppose Rome and anybody who was in league with Rome. You remember the Roman Empire was the occupying force for Israel at this time, as well as the rest of the Mediterranean world. And Israel, like everybody else, really didn't like being under the heel of the Roman boot. So there was always this seething, somebody trying to be a part of the resistance, like the French resistance to the Nazis in World War II. They might have been in charge, but basically there was a group of people trying to undercut them or stab them in the back any chance they could, kind of the underground movement. Well, that was the Zealots among the Jews. They would do violence find a Roman legionnaire out by himself, and they would love to do violence against a Jewish person who'd gotten in league with those dreaded Romans. Well, guess the kind of person who really got in league with the dreaded Romans among their Jewish colleagues would have been tax collectors, because tax collectors basically bid, that is bribed, the Roman authorities for the chance to be the tax collector over a certain locale. And they just out-bribed the other people who were bribing. And because the Romans loved to hire a local Jewish guy to be the tax collector because he knew the people better. So even though everybody, this guy over here is driving the same old 1956 chariot, but you know deep down he's also inherited a lot of land or whatever. So someone who grew up and went to high school with them all knows that kind of stuff. And so they love to get someone who would sell out their mother for a shekel. And every town had one, still do. And so that was who the tax collectors were, Jewish people who had sold their souls, because they would not only, the tax collector not only charged you what you owed Rome, whatever they could charge you extra, they got to pocket. And that's how they made their money back. There were no such things as poor tax collectors. There were also no such thing as popular tax collectors. Actually, even the Pharisees had a rule that said, despite the 10 commandments that you can't lie, the one person they said you were allowed to lie to was the tax collector. They made an exception for that. That does not apply, however, to the IRS, so don't take that as something you're going with. But anyway, they were that hated. Well, Simon the Zealot, there was nothing he would want any more than to stick a knife into a tax collector. And Simon the Zealot is one of the disciples of Jesus. And so is, on the other end of the political spectrum, Matthew, the tax collector. I wonder if Matthew had trouble sleeping around the campfire several nights. I don't know. But isn't it wonderful that Jesus' band of disciples pulled together these arch enemies and pulled them into one? And this has always been the spirit of Jesus, is to try to collect and to keep us, our spirit is to divide up and separate and push to extremes. Jesus' spirit is always to try to say, you know what, no matter how different you think you are, you have more in common than different. If we just start to see people the way Jesus did, we'd see it that way too. So it's interesting that these two are in the disciple band, but I do feel for Matthew sleeping at night anywhere close to the Simon the Zealot. Anyway, so these 12, Jesus sent out. By the way, this is the only time in verse 2 that Matthew calls these 12 apostles. Luke actually uses that word quite a number of times because the word apostle in Greek simply means the sent ones, sent out. And probably Luke uses it more in his gospel because he's going to also write that is the sequel, the book of Acts, where he's actually going to tell the story about these 12 or many of them going out as apostles, and that's a word he uses often when the early church is founded. Matthew doesn't have a second book coming, and so he doesn't call them apostle, but right here. So he sends them out. And these are his instructions. And these verses are unique to the Gospel of Matthew, not found anywhere else. Mark also has a story of Jesus sending out the 12. Luke actually has two stories, one sending out of the 12, and then the very next chapter is sending out of 72. But Matthew has them collected into one. But anyway, this is unique to Matthew, and it's a little disturbing. It's one of the first places we trip. Jesus said, right off the bat, here's his instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. All right? Now, what about that would be disturbing to you? Don't go to the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. Go only to the house of Israel. What's that? Yeah, what about the Gentiles? Especially, I have to grow up Gentile, so I'm a little disturbed by this. Some of you may not be, but, and you got to reconcile that with that this is the Gospel of Matthew. Who saw the star in the very opening of the Gospel of Matthew? Who was it that saw that star? Magi. Are the Magi's Jewish? No, they're Gentiles, and they come from far away, and they get it when nobody close to home was getting it. And how's the Gospel of Matthew going to end? The very last phrase in the Gospel of Matthew, after the resurrection, Jesus gathers them up on yet another mountain, and he says, go into where? The house of Israel? No, go into the entire world. The entire world. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. So clearly Matthew, from the first chapter to the last chapter, believes that the ultimate mission is not just to Israel. It ultimately, obviously, is going to the whole world. And by the time Matthew is written as a gospel, probably 40 years later, clearly the Gentiles are beginning to pour into the church. And even within the gospel, just a few chapters before this, there was this centurion, a Roman centurion, he asked Jesus to come heal his servant, and Jesus says, I haven't got time to come, but he says, well, if you'll just say the word, I know he'll be healed. And Jesus said, I hadn't found this kind of faith in all of Israel. Or there's a Canaanite woman who wants him to heal a child, and he says, I can't really go do that. And she says, even the dogs can eat the crumbs from the table. And he says, what great faith is this? Your child is healed. So clearly in Matthew, he's not against Gentiles. In fact, just the opposite. So what's going on? Why did Jesus send his disciples only to the house of Israel? Why did he restrict them? Here's a map of Israel in the time of Jesus. Why did he restrict him to the little gold area on the bottom and maybe the purple area, Galilee, at the top, but say, whatever you do, don't go to the green area in the middle, that's Samaria, and whatever you do, don't go outside the map. That little area about the size of Vermont. What does he mean? Well, I think this is my guess. I mean, you paid good money here to hear this, so I need to tell you what I think. I think this is actually consistent with the New Testament witness. Matthew is at no point trying to suggest that Jesus is abandoning the Old Testament, right? He's very clear about, in fact, if anything, he's taking a notch up. He's fulfilling it even deeper. We saw that in the Sermon on the Mount. The Old Testament has all these promises to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to David and his kin, and you are my chosen people, right? Now, the whole point of being chosen was for them to get the message out that God chose everybody else too. But what happens sometimes when we're chosen, we think, oh, isn't it great to be chosen? God loves me and nobody else. So that's a real temptation that sometimes the elect still have, that God only elected them. But they were actually chosen to be the light to the Gentiles. Isaiah and some other times you get the picture of this. But on the other hand, the Bible did say that God started with them. There was something special about Abraham and his kin and all that. So Jesus picks up that and fulfills God's promise saying, you know what, it starts with you. It's going to start with you again. So at this point, early in the ministry of Jesus, he's saying, here's where we're going to be. And Jesus himself, except for an occasional forage out for a retreat, stayed pretty much within Israel too. I mean, the Apostle Paul went all over the place. Jesus stayed kind of within there because he's picking up, he's bridging from the Old Testament. It's going to start here. How did Paul although Paul was the missionary to the Gentiles, when he'd go out to the far-flung Roman Empire, where did he always start when he'd establish a church? He'd always start with either a synagogue, or if there wasn't a whole synagogue, at least a small gathering of Jewish believers, because at least they already knew the Old Testament. They already were looking forward to the Messiah. So when he talked about the Messiah having already come, he didn't have to at least define what Messiah meant. So he always started with Jewish group, and then before long, Gentiles started pouring in too, and he kept noticing it again and again, and finally realized that was his calling. But he would always start there. In Galatians chapter 2, you find an argument once between the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter. In case you think that preachers never argued until the 20th century, they argued in the first century too. And read Galatians 2 sometime. Paul actually called Peter a hypocrite. And because he said Peter began, he's thinking about Acts 10 where Peter went to the house of Cornelius. He said Peter got a sense that God loved the Gentiles, and then under pressure from his Jewish friends, Peter pulled back. And he really laid it on Peter pretty strong about that. I'd love to hear what Peter would have said back. But at any rate, and he said the deal was Peter became the apostle to the Jewish people, and I became the apostle to the Gentiles. That's kind of the deal that they set up. That was kind of how that came out of all that. But Matthew knows about all of this, but he's just showing that it's starting here, but ultimately Matthew knows it goes much broader than here. But it is interesting to see that, and certainly very unique, certainly. He tells them, these disciples, as they go out, he says, take no gold, take no silver, no copper. Those are the three forms of money in that day, in your belts. Have you ever gone somewhere overseas, and instead of taking one of those little fanny packs, you had one of those little belts you could zip open and put in so you wouldn't be so easily ransacked by someone trying to pickpocket? Well, they had that in the first century as well. So normally they would put money in belts rather than bags. And so that's the image he says. When I'm sending you out, he says, you don't take all the provisions to take care of yourself. Now, so who's going to take care of them? I'm going to call you to depend on the hospitality of those who receive you. So he's telling them, you're going to have to trust me and trust that I'm going to be in the hearts of the people who are there before you get there. This was not an easy mission. You wonder, how did Jesus ever even get 12 people to sign up for this? But he sent them out, and he said, and he forbade them from providing for their own way. That's pretty unsettling, isn't it? It doesn't mean if you have a savings account, you're not a good disciple. But he is trying to say to them and remind them, don't ever forget you are in fact an interdependent world. And if you're going to carry the gospel, it was freely received, give it out freely too. You can't charge for it, but you're going to have to trust me and trust that I'm going to be present also in hearts around you. And actually in the first century, probably when Matthew wrote, this is the way early apostles did. I mean, there weren't holiday inns anywhere. How did you move? If you moved around from town to town, how did that work? Well, you had to stay in somebody's home. You had to trust someone would take you in. And hospitality in the first century was a really big deal. I mean, if someone came and knocked on your door and asked to come in, it was really a dishonor not to be hospitable. It was a really big thing. But having said all that, Jesus would also warn them that some people are going to slam the door in your face. But you just have to trust me, there's going to be enough doors open for you. So he doesn't allow them to provide for themselves. Don't even take a bag for your journey. That would be where you'd put food. Don't take 2 tunics. One outer garment, in other words, but don't take a second one in case that one got ripped to shreds or stolen or whatever. So you just have the clothes on your back. And oddly enough, don't even take sandals. Now, curiously, if you read this story in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus said, don't take an extra pair of sandals. But according to Matthew, he's saying, you go out barefooted. How many of you got tender feet? It's hard for you to walk barefooted on carpet in your own house, right? And you sure don't want to go out across pavers or much less rocks or, but how about walking around in Palestine? All kind of stuff, snakes on the ground, rocks, and there's no paved roads anywhere. This is strong language. Don't even take sandals or a staff. I mean, people carried just a walking stick, which also protected you. He's really, talk about sending them out as sheep. He's sending them out just about as defenseless as sheep are. He really is stripping them of all the things that any normal Bedouin would arm themselves with. No one would go walking around out in that world without these basic provisions. Because again, there's not a 7-Eleven on every corner. There's not any way to provide like we would today. If you don't have it with you, you don't have it. And he's saying, it's out there, it's just not in your pocket. Now, what's that about? Well, it's about trust, for certain. It's also in God as well as in the community that'll receive you. And I think it's also about trying to distinguish the early Christian mission from all the other kind of paid philosophers of the day. In the days of the New Testament, there were lots of people who just kind of spoke for money. And basically whatever you hired them to do, that'd be the position they would take. So they didn't have to believe it themselves. It's just, but if you're paying for it, I'll take your position and I'll argue for it. And so people got cynical about that, obviously. Just like you might have you ever gotten cynical about advertisements or, you read it says ocean view and you find out you'd have to stand up on the ceiling to even see the ocean out through that view. So sometimes you get cynical because people just seem like say anything to you, caveat, emptor. But, Jesus was seeming to say, and Paul will pick up on this later, Paul would almost never receive money from anybody, even when they'd try to offer it. He'd argue, as in 1 Corinthians, that it's all right to provide for the apostles, and all the other apostles were provided for. He said, am I not worthy just like they are? But instead, I'm going to come among you as a tent maker, because he's in Corinth, where all these roving philosophers were so current. He wanted to say, this message is different. So that's why I'm a tent maker on the side, because I don't want you to think that I'm just a pay-for-hire preacher. This is the gospel, and it's real, and it's true. And that spirit seems to be going on here. Jesus is saying, do not sound like all those other peddlers who just talk, but they talk for pay. There's nothing, he'll go on and say, the laborer is worthy of his hire. So hear me clearly, as a minister who has a salary here, he's not against paying the preacher. All right, everybody get that? I want to make sure you understand. It's not, but he is saying, make sure that your trust, make sure that nothing tarnishes the spirit of what you're saying, both for the preacher and for the hearer. Make sure that is really clear. I had a minister once who retired recently, and I asked him, what is it that you love most about retiring? He was still serving a small church. He said, what I love most about it is that I'm volunteering there, and I don't think I've ever enjoyed being a pastor anymore, because I know and they know I don't do it for a salary. And it just kind of frees us all up. Maybe Jesus is looking for that spirit among them. But anyway, it's pretty drastic, graphic language. Well, you go into the place, he says, and some places are going to receive you, and they will. He says don't go from house to house, too, by the way. There's these kind of commands. In other words, if you start out in this house and they take you in, But then another house says, hey, do you want to come over here? We've actually got a lanai and a pool and an outdoor kitchen. Don't suddenly feel called to the outdoor kitchen just because that'd even be nicer and had a southern view. No, he's saying if they go and they receive you, then stay there. You got to, this is an interesting kind of, in fact, that was probably also happening in the early church. Matthew's giving you a hint to some things that were going on among the roving preachers of his time. I don't think there's any question that that's probably what's happening. But some places are not going to receive you. You're going to do your best. You're going to trust me. You're going to trust them. You're going to preach the best you have. And some people are going to receive you, which is great. But just preaching just the exact same way, other people are going to, again, slam the door in your face. What I appreciate about this is that Jesus is just being honest. You cannot say that you followed Jesus and got surprised when it didn't all go smooth. Not if you read the Bible. You remember it was called An American Tale, but it's a cartoon about this little mouse that came over from Ireland to the U.S., and couldn't wait to get to the U.S. And the song that he sings on the boat that he hops on going across the ocean is, there are no cats in America, and the streets are filled with cheese. There are no cats in America, so my life will be filled with ease. And what happens when little Feifel gets to America? There are cats everywhere, and they're feral, and they love mice. And so he's disillusioned about all that because he had the wrong song. It sounded good, but it just wasn't true. Jesus is not offering that kind of little ditty. He's not suggesting that if you'll just trust me, if you go out there the way I told you and preach it the way I told you, it's all going to go great. Everyone's going to love you. Have you discovered this in your Christian journey so far? That sometimes the door slams in your face. Have you found this to be true? He's actually going to spend the rest of the chapter, if you're reading on ahead, really sort of burrowing in on this, saying, in fact, not only sometimes are they going to reject you, sometimes they're going to persecute you. This is going to cost you relationships at times. You're going to be called before places. You may even lose your life over this. So he's pretty upfront saying what you're about to get into will sometimes be really rough sledding. Now get yourself geared up for this. It doesn't mean that you were disobedient. It doesn't mean that you veered off the path. It doesn't mean that you didn't have good faith, and it doesn't mean you didn't serve God well. In fact, it may well mean that you served God well and that you're, in fact, on the path. And what he's trying to say is if you'll look down, you'll see my footprints right on the path too. This is what it means to follow me. Sometimes it's going to cost you. And this may take some imagination for those of us in our country, where the most it may have cost us is that we had to have afternoon tea times on Sundays instead of the morning. I mean, I don't know what this cost you to be a Christian, but maybe some of you could say, you know what, it cost me a lot. I have the person I grew up as best friends with in college, we can't talk anymore. The person I used to love to pal around with, they got to where they were just so gossiping and tearing everybody down, and when I told them I just didn't want to do that, suddenly they don't talk to me anymore. Maybe you'd talk about a business decision where you lost a lot of money because you wouldn't go a direction that you knew was contrary to your sense of ethics. But of course, when you get into some countries around our world, people could say, yeah, let me tell you about my mother. She was killed. My son, because he professed Christ, he was imprisoned. There's actually more people martyred as Christians today than in any other century in the entire history of Christianity. That's not just some first century relic that's now gone. More people die today for being Christians than ever before. So for many people, this is like, yep, that's the way it is. That may not be the price we'll have to pay, but Jesus is not making it light. He's trying to be honest, and frankly, I appreciate that, don't you? Be courageous then. Be strengthened. Do not think that this is just all pedaling downhill. There's going to be some tough parts. But when they do refuse you, here's where he begins to talk about this. When that happens, shake the dust off your feet against that house, even against that town, and go on to the next town as a witness against them. And he says, boy, woe to them. It's going to be harder for them than it was for Sodom and Gomorrah. What is this shaking off of the dust off of one's feet? And I have somebody barefooted there because I guess they don't have sandals either. Well, of course, it was dusty. But there was this sense of, I'm not going to let any of this cling to me as I go on to the next town. A part of that is a kind of enacted judgment. There's a kind of a spirit of, I'm not the one who brings down fire. I'm not the one who's going to, but whoever, God is in charge of this, but, I gave you the best I had. You had every opportunity, and you just said no, and I've got to go on now. Rejection is sometimes redirection, and sometimes that's what it has to be. But I also like the wisdom in shake the dust off your feet. You know what we're sometimes prone to do? We're prone to collect the dust and keep carrying it with us, like a vacuum bag never emptied, or sand collecting up on the floorboard of your car from the beach. Jesus says, wipe the dust off. Go to the next Go to the next town with clean feet, a clean heart. In other words, don't go into it like, oh, I bet you're not going to like me either, right? Go into it leaning forward. Give them every opportunity and the assumption that they're going to open the door to you as well. This is hard for us sometimes because once you've been rejected, you want to assume and get ready for the next rejection. I remember when I was in high school, we had to sell chocolate or something for some organization I was in, which I just hated to do, going door to door, Anybody ever had to do that? It's just cruel. But anyway, they had made us do it. And I don't know I guess we were saving up for some trip. So I'd go to some door and I'd knock and I'd wish they weren't there and because I'm selling this candy, it's not any good and it's too much expensive. But and if they turned me down, I'd just assume from then on no one's going to buy this. And of course, I only went to my aunts and uncles and grandparents, but still. But this is a great principle for sales. Yeah, you're going to lose some sales. Some of you in sales know this. But you got to go to the next place with your eyes and heart and spirit wide open, or you're never going to get a sale. Let's take it out of sales. Maybe you've been deeply wounded in a marriage or some other key relationship. Does that mean that all men or all women can't be trusted, that that's the way they all are, that you'll never be happy, that I'm never going to let my guard down again? Or will we ever learn to shake the dust from off our feet and go to the next town? Take an inventory of your spiritual feet and see if there's some dust clinging from some difficult and painful, maybe rejection, and see if it isn't time to wipe that off. I think there's a lot of, not surprising Jesus would say something really wise, is it? And then he changes the metaphor from sheep and wolves to say, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, because it's a dangerous world. Because it got you out here as sheep when you don't have any gnarling teeth or sharp claws or fast feet or any of that. You do need to be smart. This is about one of the only times in the Bible that serpents come off good. Snakes. Most of the time, snakes are like, like John the Baptist calling the people who came to him, you brood of vipers, who warned you? So usually you don't want to be a snake. But we're probably getting an image here from back in Genesis chapter 3. The serpent was the most shrewd of all the animals in the garden, right? And of course, there's this imagery of how it contributes to the fall, but he's picking out one aspect of the serpent, and that is that it's shrewd. It's kind of clever, tactful, thoughtful, smart, and using it in a positive way, which is kind of unusual. I don't normally think of myself wanting to be like a snake. I love this particular picture because it had the image of the dove, but you see the little scales on the background. Do you know how hard it is to find a picture of a snake and a dove on the very same picture? I mean, I looked and looked. You just can't, because they don't normally go together. They don't normally go together. For that matter, sheep and wolves don't go together very much either. Oh, by the way, except for one time. Sheep and wolves do together go once. It's in Isaiah chapter 11. It's one of these messianic passages about the shoot and the root out of the stump of David and all that. But in chapter 11 of Isaiah chapter 6, it says, on that day, the wolf will live and lie down with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat, and the calf and the lion and the yearling together. In other words, all these opposites. And a little child will even lead them. A cow will feed with a bear, and their young will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like an ox, and an infant can play near the hole of a cobra. And a young child can put its hand onto a viper's nest, and they will not harm or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So this image of these arch enemies finally being reconciled can only happen in Christ, of course. But here we have another image that just seems to totally different. Because you're going out into a really hostile kind of environment, he is not saying that you need to hang on to naivete. Yes, you trust in God. You're not armed with all kind of armor, but you do need to learn how to be tactful. You need, maybe shrewd is the right word. Don't miss that either. Sometimes we're kind of bulls in china shops, or I guess cows. But we can sometimes just simply not be smart about how we're trying to bear our witness. Learn to be smart too. Use your head. Pick your battles. Pick the right time. No matter how well you do it, you're still going to get hurt sometime, but be smart about it. But then also be harmless or innocent as doves. I love that kind of contrast, because if you work really, really hard at being snake-like smart, you might have lost your innocence and dove-likeness along the way, right? And if you just spend so much time being a little dove, you may forget how to be shrewd as a serpent. So he's calling us with these animal imageries to sort of figure out how to have some balance of both of them together. I think it's pretty interesting and clever kind of analogy. He does have this interesting phrase too when he's talking about what's going to happen. He says, so if they persecute in one town, just go to the next one. For amen, you remember we said last time, Jesus is unique because he doesn't say amen at the end of statements only. Sometimes he says amen at the beginning of a statement. Amen means truly, this is it, pay attention, well, we're all over this is really right. But he says it in front, which even makes it more exaggerated. So sometimes it comes out in our English as verily or truly, but actually it's the word amen. If they persecute in one town, go to the next one. For amen, I tell you, you won't go through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So that's the instructions said to the 12, go out, just stay in Israel. If you get rejected from one town, go to the next one. You won't have gone all the way through before the end comes. Now, is that a troublesome verse? The answer is yes. Yes, good. What's troublesome about that? That made it look like that they're not even going to get back from their little missionary journey before it's over. You know, you're not even going to finish the circuit before I'm back. The Son of Man coming. That's kind of an end times kind of thing. You ever heard of Albert Schweitzer, the great physician, who then became a great Christian, ended up serving his last years in Africa, combining both ministry and medicine. But he wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus over 100 years ago. It's a big thing that only seminarians, I guess, read now. But this was the verse, this very verse, is the one that was the hinge of Schweitzer's whole idea. His position and his interpretation of the ministry of Jesus was this, that Jesus really was so sure that the end was coming so soon that he basically, his whole ministry was to kind of bring it in through his preaching, teaching, healing, etc. And that even on this occasion, Jesus even thought, he said, that the end would come right away. And then this was the first disappointment, he said, that Jesus faced when he realized, wow, God's timing is longer than we thought. Schweitzer even goes on to say that Jesus kept pushing the envelope, trying to make it happen, kind of forcing God's hand, and that finally, even on the cross, it was one final desperate attempt on Jesus' part, so says Schweitzer, to sort of turn the wheel of God's timing, and in fact, then the wheel rolled back over and crushed him. So he has this fairly downer view of Jesus' ministry, and said that, so Jesus' teaching, he said, was all what he called an interim ethic. It was just, even that's why it was so severe, because it was just designed to be a short burst. No one could do this for a long time because it's just going to be such a short while before God brings all this to a close. So I bring this verse up only because that was really pivotal for his understanding and for his teaching. And he actually had a lot of influence for about 100 years on the readings of the New Testament. But that's, many people would say, that's obviously a tremendous overreach of this. But what it does give an example of is that in the time, including in the time of Matthew 30 years later or 40 years later, there was a very strong expectation in the early church that this isn't going to be very long. We're just in for a short while here. You remember Paul saying, if you're married to an unbeliever, you ain't got time to go through a divorce. You ain't got time for that. Doesn't matter. And if you're not married, don't bother to get married. If you are married, don't bother to get unmarried. Whatever. If you've got money, give all the money, because it doesn't matter. What are you going to need it for? And of course, that's what the early church did, right, in Jerusalem. And then when the famine hit, of course, nobody had any resources, which is why Paul's out there taking up an offering in the Gentile churches to try to provide for them. But when they did pour out all their money and give it to the apostles' feet, they really believed that we're only talking about a couple weeks here. That was the early expectation that he's coming just right now. I mean, what did he say when he went up in Acts? He said, men of Galilee, why are you staring this way? I'm going to come back to just in the same way. So they really thought it was right away. And as the New Testament goes on, the later books in the New Testament show that they're beginning to wrestle with, okay, now some people are dying. We didn't think anybody was going to die before he came back. Now they are. What happens to them, and how long is this going to be? And then by the later books, they're trying to set up, okay, we need to have some officers in the church, and let's talk about how we carry the faith forward to the next generation, because this is going to be a longer haul. So they started out getting ready for a sprint. In the New Testament, we realized, no, I think we're in a marathon, and now it's 2,000 years later. But we probably do have, even in the time of Matthew, we probably have this feeling. And why would Matthew make this up? I mean, I think he's wrestling with something that he knows goes back to the words of Jesus. There's this immediacy of how soon this is all going to be. So it's a fascinating passage, certainly because of that. Anyway, he does say, you're going to be dragged before councils. You're likely to suffer in all kinds of ways. Don't worry about what to say. I'm going to give it to you. He's certainly imagining here that they're going to have some suffering, and probably already by Matthew's time. There's not a Roman persecution yet, but there's beginning to be some persecution of believers. Even the Apostle Paul, what was he before he was the Apostle Paul? He was Saul going out rounding up Christians, and so there was persecution that was breaking out fairly early on. That's happening in Matthew's churches. That's going on in the people he said. So he's trying to say to them, this was to be expected. You know it's coming. But he's saying, don't be afraid. Don't let the fact that it's going to happen, don't let that terrorize you. Don't make you too quiet nor too sheltered. Ultimately, he says in verse 28, don't have any fear of them, the person who can kill the body, but that's all they can do. But rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. Now, what is fearing him meaning God? Don't fear local magistrates. The worst they can do is kill you, which seemed like a pretty good bit, but that's the worst they can do. If you're going to fear somebody, fear the one who can get both body and soul. It doesn't mean that your body has a little soul like Casper the Ghost inside of it. These are both Hebrew ideas for different aspects of the totality of a person, but the soul was often that way of talking about the real you. There's your body, but then there's the real you. It's what makes you you. And no matter what they can do to your body, they can't ever really capture the real you, right? People who've been courageous in prisons and all that kind of thing won't be broken. That way the real them stays there. But he says, fear the one who can, get both of those. Now, by the way, what is fearing God like? Let me just give you an example. It's in Psalm chapter 33, verse something. There we go, verse 18. The eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him. And then looks at this parallel. On those whose hope is in his unfailing love to deliver them from death and to keep them alive in famine. So the fear of the Lord is not a kind of trembling before, it's rather, as I heard Lech Walesa, the leader of the Solidarity movement in Poland, he was asked once, because he got all kind of pressure against Soviet Russia and all that. He said, what keeps you up at night? He said, you know what, I fear God, and so I sleep well at night. And that's the idea. The fear means this ultimate respect, fear in that sense. If that's where your ultimate respect goes, that ultimately God's in charge of this, then all the other fears are put in their appropriate place. It doesn't mean that you look forward to it, but you don't have to fear them the most. But I want to stop for just a moment. Fear the one who can throw body and soul, destroy them in Gehenna. Matthew, more than any of the other four Gospels, and we're going to see this the next two sessions as well, he really warms up to, or let's say collects together, sayings that relate to punishment in the end times. If you're ever wondering, I mean, I don't mean he's a hellfire preacher, but there's fire and brimstone and singes of sulfur on the pages of Matthew in quite a number of places. This is one of the first times we've seen it, but there are going to be quite a number of others. A number of the parables end with this. We're going to see a good bit of this. But Gehenna is the actual word that is used. What is that? The Hinnom Valley, which is what Gehenna stands for, is on the southern side of Jerusalem. That map on the left is the kind of ancient city wall. You see the temple there, is that yellow thing there. And then the Mount of Olives would be just where it says Hinnom Valley, the words, that's there on that side there. But on the southern side of the city, where that red arrow is, there's a valley on that side outside the gate called the Hinnom Valley. This was a valley in the Old Testament that became kind of a cursed valley. One of the kings in the Old Testament so sold out to the foreign pagan idol gods around him who required child sacrifice that he actually killed 2 of his own children in this valley. That's where he did it, which was such an abomination, of course, violated everything that God wanted for his people. Anyway, it became such a cursed place that it became the place that nobody wanted to do anything with. It'd be like the toxic waste area, something. So because of that, it became a cemetery, it became where the dead, and it became kind of a trash heap. This is where people sort of threw the garbage. Normally the trade winds blew this way across, so whatever stench there was in the garbage heap, you wouldn't have to smell it unless occasionally the wind turned the other way, and then everybody said, boy, that's Hinnom there. And then from time to time, they would set it on fire just to try to, burn it down before you put more compost on top of it. So most people are in and around Jerusalem were familiar with Gehenna, that Hinnom Valley, its cursed origins, but also that it's this kind of smelly, terrible place. No one would want to be there. It has stench to it. The worms are everywhere and the flames. And one of the images used for hell is where the worm dieth not and where the flames never quench, right? And it's Gehenna, that is, the imagery is drawn from this valley that was pretty close by. Just as I think you could say that heaven is whatever's the best you can imagine times infinity, hell would be the worst you can imagine times infinity. Well, the worst place they could imagine was this valley. So those are the images that are used when Jesus describes what it means if you are thrown out from God's presence. But that's kind of the background of where that sort of comes from. We're going to talk about that a little bit more with some of the parables. And here's an example of this trash heap and then with it being set on fire. Not a very nice place to be. Jesus says, this is verse 34. He says, do you think I've come to bring peace on the earth? I mean, what did the angels say? Peace among, peace on earth, all that. Do you think I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. Now, is that a troublesome passage? The answer is yes. Wow. And actually, I don't think it's because he's out handing out swords, certainly not to us. It doesn't mean it's the purpose of his coming, but it is the result of his coming. He ends up quoting from the book of Micah, but he just basically says, because of me, there are going to be some parents turned against children. And there's going to be friends who are separated as if by a sword. And there are going to be even the most intimate relationships where people will betray each other. And they're going to be turned against each other. So again, it's kind of really honest that following me you may have to pay a price in the deepest, there's a cost in effect to that that's going to come, and so just be aware of that. It is going to be part of what happens. But on the other hand, he ends up coming back to a set of things. But whoever does receive, if you receive a prophet, if you receive a righteous person, or even as he says in this verse, if you even receive just one of these the littlest of the disciples, does anybody feel like that's you? I'll never be a Billy Graham. I guess at least I'm a littlest one. Well, here you are. Here's your place in the Bible. If you even receive the littlest of the disciples, and give them it's like giving them a cup of cold water. And you may not remember it, but God will never forget it. When you talk to your children and have them remember their childhood, Have you ever been surprised that they remember the most funny, small little things that you completely forgot? You know, you spent all that money taking them to Disneyland when they were 4. They don't even remember that. They remember some little tiny thing. Have you ever gone back to a high school reunion and somebody remembers some little something, that some little joke or some little, and you might have almost forgotten about it. It was just so small. Make no mistake, these cups of cold water, these small little acts are actually the small hinges upon which the big doors of our lives turn. We most of the time are not going to have to come up with a cure for a virus or a patent that, or end a war. But all of us we could all pass out a cup of cold water. Now, what might that mean? It might mean opening a door. It might mean saying a nice word. It might mean just putting your shoulder up next to something. It might mean listening instead of talking. It might mean spending a little more time over coffee. It might mean visiting with someone who's alone. It might mean writing that thank you note in a handwritten note. What will a cup of cold water mean for you and for me? Or for that matter, how many of you have received such a cup of cold water? Has anybody been kind to you during this pandemic? Who are the people who have been kind of keeping you going? All right? So make no mistake about it. When you do that, you never lose your reward. Jesus says reward is kind of but where does it all end? He's trying to say to them and to us that it's going to be hard. Sometimes it's going to be hard sledding. I'm sending you out. Some are going to receive you. Some are going to reject you. But keep in mind the end. And the end is not the suffering. The end is on the other side of the suffering. And then he appeals, I think, even to himself. Just as they received, if you receive me, you receive the one who sent me. If they receive you, they receive me. Where does the Bible end? In the book of Revelation. This scene in Revelation chapter 5, verse 6, where the author says, and here's what I see at the end. There's a lamb. There's a lamb standing as though slain. This is one of the pictures you often see in stained glass windows. How do you picture a lamb that's standing even though it was slain? And of course, the picture of Jesus, which often in the Gospels, his death is as kind of this sacrificial paschal lamb for us all, but standing because he's resurrected. But the last image, here's where history ends, brings this image of the lamb back. And so this defenseless, as Jesus must have looked on the cross, it looked like on the cross that the wolves won, didn't it? You see their fangs bared, you see their claws getting into him. It looks like the wolves win on Calvary. But in the end, it's the lamb that's standing. He sent us out as lambs among the wolves. And no matter how tempting it is to go ahead and become a wolf, if we'll trust him, here's the prayer, and the only prayer that lambs have. They have a shepherd who happens to actually even be stronger than the wolf. I was in Israel once, and we were on an interstate, and there was a flock of, what are lambs? Herds? What do lambs come in? A club, whatever. Anyway, a herd, flock. It was a flock of lambs. Sound like geese. Are you sure it's flock? Anyway, someone do correct on that. Anyway, there were a bunch of lambs on this road, and it's an interstate. And cars are going all around it. If they'd been here, we'd have had an 8-car pileup. But anyway, no one hit the lambs. But there was a shepherd there kind of walking along, and they were taking up 3 lanes of the interstate, just a bunch of lambs. And I thought, whoa, talk about amongst the wolves. Here I am in my wolf car. But they were safe because at least they had a shepherd. And that's our prayer too. But also in the end, the lambs win. The lambs win, friends. You win. And if you look around in that last picture, there isn't a wolf in sight. Tra-la-la-la-la. And after Jesus finished these instructions, he went on from there to preach and teach in the cities. And that's how this was brought to a close. Well, my fellow sheep, it's been great to see you. Don't be afraid. Our shepherd goes before us. There are wolves out there. But in the end, it belongs to the lambs. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that even though we are not self-defended, we are not defenseless because we have you. Which doesn't mean that we will not be scarred up. Doesn't mean that there'll be no suffering. Doesn't mean the road is always easy, just probably the opposite. But it will never be without meaning. It will go somewhere that is ultimately to you. And along the way, we will both have the chance to receive and to give those little cups of cold water that might be the difference in someone taking another step down the road or quitting. We do this then for your glory because freely we have received, so freely we will give. In Jesus, the Lamb of God's name, we pray. Amen. Good night, all.